The cold bit through the thick leather of his flight jacket, a familiar, almost comforting enemy. Oberleutnant Dieter Baumann, at 24 years old with 41 confirmed kills painted in neat black crosses below his cockpit, scanned the endless blue over the North Sea. It was 10:17 hours, April 8, 1944. The air at 75 meters tasted thin and metallic through his oxygen mask. Below, the quilted gray and white of the cloud deck stretched to the horizon, hiding the churning waters of the Norwegian Sea. His Messerschmitt Bf 109G-6, wrote Dre, hummed around him, a symphony of mechanical precision he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. Through the crackle of his headset came the voice of his wingman, Unteroffizier Karl Vogt, young, eager, and still riding the high of his first kill 2 weeks prior. Herr Oberleutnant, Vogt's voice was light, almost laughing. Radar reports a small formation of Wehrmachts heading for the coast. No fighter escort, a milk run. Baumann allowed himself a thin smile behind his mask. Wehrmachts, 4-engine bombers. American B-17 Flying Fortresses or British Lancasters. Big, slow, and fat. Dangerous in their massed formations, but alone. They were flying coffins. The intelligence briefings that morning had been unequivocal. Allied fighter escort range was still limited. They could not penetrate this far into the Reich's northern flank. The Americans, with their heavy, fuel-thirsty fighters, were tethered to their bases in England. It was a simple, immutable fact of physics and logistics. "Stay sharp, Karl," Baumann replied, his voice calm, professional. "Even a milk run can curdle." But he didn't believe it. Not today. The weather was perfect for a high-altitude interception, and his swarm of 4 109s was composed of veterans. They had trained for this. The slashing attack, the head-on pass through the bomber box, the careful aiming at cockpit or engines. They were the predators. The bombers were the prey. The calculus of the air war over Europe, as the Luftwaffe High Command understood it in the spring of 1944, still favored the quality of German engineering and pilot skill over the brute industrial output of the Allies. They had been told repeatedly that American pilots were inadequately trained, their machines inferior in everything but ruggedness. The Bf 109 was lighter, more agile, and in the hands of a man like Baumann, who had learned his craft in the deadly skies over Stalingrad, it was a rapier to the American broadsword. He banked gently, the ailerons responding with a slight pressure from his left hand. The sun glinted off the other 3 109s in his formation. They were hunters, knights of the sky, and the realm below was theirs to defend. What Dieter Baumann could not know, as he settled into the patient, predatory cruise towards the reported coordinates, was that the fundamental arithmetic of aerial warfare was undergoing a silent, seismic shift. The briefings he trusted were already obsolete, fatally flawed by a cascade of intelligence failures and cultural arrogance. And the small, unescorted bomber formation was not a vulnerability. It was bait. The confidence that filled Baumann's cockpit that April morning was not born of mere arrogance. It was the product of years of accumulated evidence and institutional belief. Since the early days of the war, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies. The Bf 109, first-blooded in the Spanish Civil War, had proven itself time and again against Polish, French, British, and Soviet aircraft. German aces had tallied scores that seemed mythical. Marseille, Barkhorn, Hartmann. Their tactics were refined, their training, though now compressed by wartime demands, still produced pilots of exceptional caliber. Against the Americans, the initial encounters had seemed to confirm all preconceptions. Intelligence summaries from the Abwehr and Luftwaffe analysis branches, which Baumann sometimes saw filtered down to squadron level, painted a clear picture. American industry, while vast, was inefficient and plagued by labor disputes. Their fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, were heavy, complex machines, unsuited for the delicate dance of dogfighting. A report from late 1943, still circulated in early '44, stated authoritatively, "The P-51 Mustang, a new American fighter, is a mediocre adaptation of a British airframe with an underpowered Allison engine. Its performance above 20,000 feet is particularly poor, and it poses no significant threat to our Bf-109G or FW-190A series fighters." This assessment was based on solid, but catastrophically outdated, information. It was true of the early P-51A and Mustang Mk.I models. The intelligence apparatus had captured, examined, and dismissed them. What they had missed was the quiet revolution happening in a hangar in England. They had missed the marriage, born of desperate British need and American industrial flexibility, of the sleek North American aviation airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was not a mediocre aircraft. It was a Predator reborn. Cultural biases seeped into tactical assessments. A memo from a senior Luftwaffe staff officer, intercepted after the war, captured the sentiment. The American fighting man is technically proficient, but lacks the Fingerspitzengefühl, the instinctive feel, of the German pilot. He relies on machinery and procedure over individual initiative and courage. In a contest of machines alone, we may face challenges. In a contest of men and machines, we remain supreme. This belief in innate German superiority, a toxic byproduct of Nazi ideology, blinded the command structure to the evolving nature of the threat. They were preparing for the War of 1942, while their enemy had already leapt to 1944. There were dissenting voices, of course. Men like Oberleutnant Werner Schröer, a decorated ace commanding JG-3, had begun to file cautious, worried reports after encounters over Bremen in late 1943. He noted unusually high-performance Allied fighters that could engage at altitudes previously considered safe. His reports were flagged, debated in stuffy Berlin offices, and ultimately attributed to combat stress or misidentification in the heat of battle. The system, confident in its own infallibility, rejected information that contradicted its core beliefs. The fate of Schröer's reports was shared by others. A technical analysis from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, in January 1944 concluded that the rumored performance figures for a new long-range American fighter were physically impossible given known fuel capacity and engine technology. The analysis was technically brilliant. Its foundational data was utterly wrong. While German commanders studied maps and production charts that showed a manageable, if escalating, threat, a storm was gathering that no ledger in Berlin could quantify. Its epicenter was not a secret base, but an entire nation operating at a scale that defied European comprehension. The weapon was not merely a new airplane. It was an ecosystem of industry, innovation, and relentless, focused will. In a sprawling complex in Inglewood, California, North American Aviation's factory was a temple of organized chaos. The production lines for the P-51 billion and C Mustangs, the ones with the Merlin engine, were hitting a rhythm that German intelligence would have dismissed as propaganda. The figures, when laid bare, are staggering. In 1943, North American built 22 Mustangs. In 1944, that number would explode to over 14,000. To put that in perspective, German production of the Bf-109, its workhorse fighter, peaked at around 1,500 units for the entire year of 1944. This wasn't a difference of degree. It was a difference of kind. The man behind the machine's transformation was not a military strategist, but a brilliant, driven engineer named Edgar Schmude, a German immigrant who had fled the turmoil of his homeland in the 1920s. Schmude poured his expertise into the Mustang's design. He obsessed over details German engineers, constrained by resource shortages and constant design changes, could only dream of. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that reduced drag dramatically, was not just a theory on paper. It was being stamped out by the thousands. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V-1650 engine, a masterpiece of precision engineering, produced over 1,500 horsepower and, crucially, maintained that power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the Bf-109's performance began to fall off a cliff. But the Mustang's true secret, the innovation that would shatter the Luftwaffe's strategic reality, was not just its speed or its graceful lines. It was its stomach. Through a combination of ingenious internal fuel tank placement and the development of sleek, jettisonable external tanks, the P-51 could carry over 400 gallons of fuel. A report from the USAAF's 8th Air Force in late 1943, a document that never made it to German desks, stated simply, with two 75-gallon external tanks, the P-51 billion has an operational radius in excess of 650 miles. It can escort our bombers to Berlin and back. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, a target previously considered beyond the protective reach of Allied fighters. This single technical fact rendered every German defensive plan obsolete. The safe havens for bomber formations, the gaps in fighter coverage the Luftwaffe relied upon to inflict crippling losses, were about to vanish. And the men flying these new machines were not the farm boys with minimal training of German caricature. They were a new breed. College graduates, former civilians, trained in a system that emphasized gunnery, formation flying, and energy tactics. They lacked the hardened, thousand-mission experience of a Baumann, but they came in numbers he could not fathom, flying machines whose capabilities he had been assured were impossible. The first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt, but not understood. In the bitter winter of 1943-44, Luftwaffe pilots began returning from interceptions with strange, unsettling stories. Lieutenant Franz Hauser of JG-26 reported an engagement near Wilhelmshaven on December 16, 1943. "I attacked a formation of B-17s from the rear quarter," he wrote in his after-action report. "As I closed, I saw two small, sleek fighters peeling off from the bomber stream. They were not thunderbolts. They were too small. They turned into my attack with a rate of roll I have never seen. I broke off. Their climb rate was astonishing." His squadron commander, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, scribbled in the margin, "Probable Spitfire IX variant, unlikely to have significant range." A more detailed report came from Feldwebel Johann Keller of JG-1 after a mission over Holland on January 11, 1944. He managed to get a sustained look at one of the new fighters. The aircraft had a distinctive air scoop under the fuselage, aft of the cockpit. Its wings were very clean with a gentle taper. It carried drop tanks. Crucially, it stayed with the bomber formation long after the Thunderbolts and Lightnings had turned for home. This report was forwarded to technical intelligence. The analysts identified it as a likely P-51 Allison-engined variant. Performance described is exaggerated. Drop tanks indicate ferry flight, not combat patrol. The most prescient warning came from a captured American pilot, a B-17 co-pilot shot down over Münster in February 1944. During interrogation, he mentioned almost casually that the new little friends were now with them all the way to the target. The interrogator, a Luftwaffe officer, pressed him. "The Mustangs, they have the range," the prisoner nodded. "Yeah, they've got these new tanks. They're with us the whole way now. It's a real morale booster." This critical piece of information was buried in page 17 of a 30-page interrogation summary, categorized as prisoner propaganda/boasting. The disconnect between frontline experience and high command belief grew into a chasm. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe's own loss statistics began to show a disturbing trend. The kill-to-loss ratio against American fighters, which had been favorable, began to tighten. Veteran aces were being shot down in circumstances that puzzled their comrades. The official explanation from Berlin was increased aggression due to Allied desperation, and temporary numerical superiority in local sectors. The idea that the Americans had fielded a qualitatively superior fighter in massive numbers was dismissed. It violated the foundational narrative of German technical and martial supremacy. Dieter Baumann was aware of the rumors, the mess hall talk of Die kleinen Teufel, the little devils. He had dismissed them as the nervous chatter of newer pilots. His world was one of tangible reality, the feel of the stick, the readout of his instruments, the black and white certainty of a kill. The briefing said the bombers ahead were unprotected. His eyes, scanning the empty sky around them, confirmed it. The system, for all its growing flaws, had never failed him before. Why would it fail him now, on a clear day over his own operational domain? Rote Dre sliced through the cold air, a gray arrow against the blue. Baumann's eyes, perpetually moving, caught a smudge on the horizon, a faint darkening against the cloud layer. He keyed his radio. Horrido, all units. Visual contact, bearing 090, slightly low. Count 12, maybe 14 Wehrmachts. No escort visible, confirm. One by one his pilots confirmed. Voggt's voice was tight with excitement. Confirmed, Herr Oberleutnant. No fighters. They are alone. The formation resolved into the distinct, cruciform shapes of B-17s. They flew in a loose combat box, their olive drab and gray camouflage standing out against the white clouds below. Sun glinted off their plexiglass noses and turrets. Baumann felt the old, cold focus settle over him. This was the moment. The planning, the climb, the search all culminated in this approach. He led his swarm in a wide, curving turn to position them for a head-on attack, the most dangerous but effective method against the fortress's formidable forward firepower. "Attack plan Eisenhammer," he transmitted, his voice flat and calm. "Line astern, head-on pass through the lead element. Aim for cockpits and engines. Break left and down after firing. Reform at 5,000 meters cloud layer." "Understood," 3 crisp, Verstand and S answered him. He pushed the throttle forward slightly, feeling the DB-605 engine's growl deepen. The airspeed crept up. The distance closed with terrifying speed. In a head-on pass, 2 aircraft converging at a combined speed of over 800 kilometers per hour, the window for aiming and firing was less than 2 seconds. It was a test of nerve, precision, and faith in your machine. At 8 kilometers out, Baumann's practiced eye began to pick out details. The lead bomber's chin turret was tracking them. He could imagine the American gunner, eyes wide, hands on his controls. At 5 kilometers, he placed the pipper of his Rivi 16 billion gun sight just ahead of the B-17's nose, compensating for deflection. He flipped the safety off his twin 13 MG-100 and 31 machine guns, and single 20 MG-100 and 51/20 cannon mounted in the propeller hub. The world narrowed to the circle of his gun sight and the growing shape of the bomber. At 3 kilometers, he started a shallow dive to increase closure speed. The bomber filled his vision. He could see the individual panes of the cockpit glass. At 2 kilometers, his finger tightened on the trigger. And then, from high above and behind the bomber formation, where the sun hung in the eastern sky, a dozen new shapes detached themselves from the glare. They fell like silver hawks, their dives so swift and steep they seemed to warp the air around them. They didn't have the bulky, brutish lines of the Thunderbolt. They were slender, elegant, and they moved with a purpose that was instantly, fundamentally alien to the tactical picture Baumann's mind had constructed. They were not climbing laboriously to intercept. They were already there above him, and they were converting that altitude into devastating speed. "Achtung!" Someone screamed over the radio, Voggt's voice, shrill with panic. "Jäger! Hoch oben, fighters, high above!" Baumann's head snapped up, his attack on the bomber forgotten. His eyes, straining against the sun's glare, caught the glint on wings, the distinctive shape of a belly air intake. His brain, trained on aircraft recognition silhouettes, supplied the name before his conscious mind could process the impossibility. P-51 Mustang. But it couldn't be. The briefings, the intelligence, the immutable laws of range. They all said it couldn't be here, over the North Sea, hundreds of kilometers from any conceivable Allied base. A cold knot, entirely separate from the high-altitude chill, formed in his stomach. The calculations that governed his existence as a pilot were crumbling in real time. The diving Mustangs didn't head for the bombers. They ignored them completely. They aimed directly for the swarm of Bf-109s, their dive angles so steep they seemed to be in freefall. Baumann had never seen fighters dive with such controlled aggression. The Thunderbolts did it, but they were like falling anvils. These things were like rapiers dropped from a tower. Break off attack, Baumann yelled, hauling back on the stick and kicking right rudder. His 109 shuddered as he pulled it into a climbing turn, abandoning the head-on run. The bomber formation was suddenly irrelevant. The new threat demanded every ounce of his skill. Around him, his other pilots scattered, their perfectly coordinated attack dissolving into individual fights for survival. The first two Mustangs leveled out of their dive not behind the 109s, but in front of and above them, having converted their altitude into blistering level speed. They executed a rolling reversal that seemed to defy physics, their wings flashing in the sun, and came around in a turn so tight Baumann's experienced eye knew instantly. His Bf-109 could not match it. Not here. Not at this speed and altitude. "Sie sind zu schnell, they are too fast," another pilot shouted. The lead Mustang, its nose painted a bright yellow, settled onto the tail of Vogg's aircraft. Carl was trying to turn, to shake his pursuer, performing the classic defensive maneuvers they had drilled 100 times. But the Mustang stayed with him, not just matching but seemingly anticipating his moves. The distance closed relentlessly. Baumann heard Vogg's breath, ragged and loud over the radio. "I can't. He's sticking, Herr Oberleutnant." Then came a sound Dieter Baumann had heard before, but never with such dreadful mechanical finality. Not the pop-pop-pop of rifle-caliber machine guns or the slower thump-thump of cannons. This was a sustained, ripping, tearing sound, like a giant canvas being shredded at high speed. It was the sound of 650 caliber Browning M12 machine guns firing in unison, a torrent of half-inch diameter, high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds spewing forth at a combined rate of over 4,000 rounds per minute. The convergence point of those 6 streams of fire walked up Vogg's fuselage. Baumann saw pieces, a chunk of the tail, then fragments of the canopy, fly off into the slipstream. The Bf-109 seemed to stagger in midair, a puff of dark smoke erupting from its engine cowling. Then the smoke turned to flame, a bright, oily orange that engulfed the forward fuselage. The aircraft nosed down, no longer a machine of war but a funeral pyre, and began its long, tumbling descent toward the cloud deck. "Carl!" Baumann shouted, but there was no response, only the hiss of static. The yellow-nosed Mustang pulled up and away, seeking another target. It had killed with a chilling, surgical efficiency. No prolonged dogfight, no twisting, turning duel. It had been an ambush, an execution. The American had used his superior speed from the dive to set up the shot, and his aircraft's stability and firepower had done the rest. Baumann's own survival instincts, honed over years of combat, kicked in. He shoved the throttle to the emergency war power setting, feeling the engine scream in protest. He needed altitude, needed to get above these devils. The Bf-109 was still a superb climber at lower altitudes. He pointed the nose up, watching the altimeter needle begin to swing. He risked a glance over his shoulder. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The initial dozen Mustangs were just the tip of the spear. As he climbed, breaking through a thin layer of cirrus cloud, he saw the sky above him was not empty. It was filled. Squadron after squadron of P-51s circled at high altitude, their silver skins glittering in the sun like scales on a fish. They flew in loose, confident formations of 4, stacked in layers. He estimated their numbers in the dozens, then gave up. There were too many. They weren't just escorting this one bomber formation. They were saturating the airspace, creating an impenetrable fighter screen that stretched across the horizon. This was not a tactical escort mission. It was a statement of absolute aerial dominance. His radio, which had been a cacophony of panic, suddenly erupted with new voices, calls from other German fighter units, vectored towards what they thought were unprotected bombers. Eisern leader to all units. Heavy fighter escort. Repeat, heavy fighter escort. Mustangs, Überall everywhere. They're above us, they have the altitude advantage. My engine's hit, I'm losing power. Verflucht Amerikaner. Where did they come from? The air was no longer a vast, empty battlefield where he could hunt. It had become a killing zone, meticulously prepared and controlled by an enemy who had just rewritten all the rules. The small formation of Wehrmachts had been the anvil. These swarms of Mustangs were the hammer. One of the high-flying P-51s, having spotted his lone climbing 109, tipped over into a dive. Baumann watched it come, a sense of surreal detachment washing over him. The intelligence was wrong. The briefings were lies. The comforting certainties of German engineering superiority evaporated as he watched the enemy fighter accelerate in its dive with a smoothness and speed his Messerschmitt could never achieve. It wasn't just faster. It was in a completely different category of performance. He had to fight. He couldn't outrun it in a dive. He couldn't outclimb it now that it had the energy advantage. His only chance was to outturn it, to use the 109's legendary agility at lower speeds. He waited, heart pounding against his ribs, as the Mustang grew larger in his mirror. At the last second, he slammed the stick hard left and stomped on full left rudder, throwing his aircraft into a maximum G brake turn. The 109 responded, the wings groaning, the G-force crushing him into his seat, blurring his vision. He completed the turn, looking frantically for his attacker. The Mustang was already there. It hadn't tried to follow his turn. It had pulled up into a high yo-yo, trading its dive speed for altitude, and then rolled back down, ending up directly behind him again, its nose pointed squarely at his cockpit. The pilot had never lost sight of him, never been forced into a turning fight. He had used his aircraft's energy retention, a concept Baumann understood, but had never seen exploited with such brutal mastery, to maintain the tactical advantage. The ripping canvas sound of the 650 cals began again. Tracers, glowing red, streaked past his canopy, so close he could hear their supersonic crack. He jinked violently right, then left, feeling the impacts as rounds tore through his left wingtip and tail section. The controls went sloppy. A warning light for the rudder actuator blinked on his instrument panel. He was bleeding speed, losing control, and the Mustang was still there, a relentless silver shadow. He dove for the cloud deck 3,000 meters below, the only sanctuary left. Maybe in the clouds he could lose it. The altimeter unwound in a frantic spin. The airspeed indicator redlined. The 109 shuddered, threatening to come apart. He plunged into the top of the cloud layer, a world of sudden, blinding gray. He cut the throttle, listening, his own breathing loud in the confines of the oxygen mask. The only sound was the rush of wind and the pounding of his heart. For 10 seconds, 20, there was nothing. Had he lost him? Then, to his right, a shape materialized from the murk, not the Mustang. Another Bf-109 trailing smoke, its pilot frantically waving a hand. It was one of his swarm, Lieutenant Brandt. Baumann keyed his radio, a whisper. "Brandt. Status?" Before Brandt could answer, the gray cloud behind them dissolved into a roaring, silver nightmare. The yellow-nosed Mustang exploded from the mist, not behind them but beside them, having anticipated the dive into the clouds. Its pilot had simply followed them down, his confidence in his aircraft's performance and his own instruments absolute. The 6 guns flashed. Brandt's aircraft disintegrated in a cataclysm of flame and shattered metal, the explosion illuminating the cloud interior with a brief, hellish orange light. Shrapnel rattled against Baumann's fuselage. The Mustang pilot, having claimed his second kill, pulled up and vanished back into the cloud, a ghost in the machine. He wasn't finished. He was hunting. Baumann was alone, his aircraft damaged, his formation annihilated, his understanding of the war shattered. The cloud layer was no longer safety. It was a labyrinth where a better equipped, more numerous predator stalked him. He leveled out, his mind racing. He had to get home. He had to report this. They had to know. He broke out of the bottom of the clouds at 1,500 meters. The North Sea sprawled below, cold and dark. The coast of Norway was a smudge on the horizon. He turned towards it, nursing his damaged 109, scanning the sky desperately. For a moment he saw nothing but empty gray. Then he looked up. Above the cloud layer he had just escaped, the sky was alive with contrails, hundreds of them, scribing a vast, crisscrossing pattern across the blue. They were the fingerprints of the Mustang squadrons, a graphic, undeniable testament to their numbers and their presence. This was not a raid. It was an occupation of German airspace. And then from a gap in the clouds high to the east, a new formation appeared. Not bombers, not the fighters that had killed his men. These were different. They flew in a stately, deliberate procession, their twin tails and four engines unmistakable even at this distance. B-24 Liberators, a second bomber stream miles behind the first. And swarming around them like protective hornets were more Mustangs, dozens more. They were not just escorting to the target, they were escorting back. The entire doctrinal foundation of the Reichsverteidigung, the defense of the Reich, which relied on attacking bomber formations after their fighter escort had turned back, was null and void. The bombers were never alone. They were the center of a mobile, all-encompassing shield of fighters that could go anywhere they could. A transmission cut through the radio, weak with distance but clear in its desperation. It was the voice of a German ground controller, somewhere on the Norwegian coast. To all Wildesau units, all Zersterer groups, massive Allied air fleet inbound. Composition includes unprecedented numbers of long-range fighter escorts. All interception plans are canceled. Repeat, all interception plans are canceled. Do not engage. I say again, do not engage. The transmission dissolved into a screech of jamming. Baumann stared at the armada in the sky. The cold knot in his stomach had become a void. The laughter in the briefing room, the dismissive reports, the absolute certainty of German superiority, it all echoed in his mind. A cruel joke whose punchline was written in the contrails above and the burning wreckage of his comrades below. He was almost to the coast, almost to safety. He allowed himself a single, shuddering breath. He had survived. He would land. He would tell them what he had seen. A shadow fell across his cockpit. He didn't need to look. He knew the shape. He knew the sound of the engine, a deep, powerful Merlin purr that was now the most terrifying sound in the world. The yellow-nosed Mustang had found him again. It was off his right wing, slightly high, matching his speed with an ease that was insulting. The American pilot was looking right at him. Baumann could see the dark shape of the man's helmet, the glint of his goggles. For a long, suspended moment, they flew in formation, the hunter and the hunted, separated by less than 50 meters of empty air. The Mustang pilot made no move to attack. He just watched. Then, slowly, deliberately, the P-51 rocked its wings twice, a universal aerial signal. Follow me. Baumann's damaged 109 couldn't outrun it, couldn't outfight it. His fuel was low. His options had vanished. The American wasn't shooting. He was offering a choice, surrender or be destroyed. With a numbness that went deeper than fear, Dieter Baumann looked from the Mustang on his wing to the distant coastline, then down at the instrument panel of his beloved Rote Dre. The rudder warning light glowed steadily. The fuel gauge needle trembled near the empty mark. The altimeter read 1,200 meters and falling slowly. He looked back at the Mustang. The American pilot pointed down, towards the cold, gray expanse of the North Sea, and then pointed again at Baumann, the gesture unmistakable. Land or else. Baumann's hand hovered over the throttle. His mind, the mind of an ace, A knight of the Third Reich calculated angles of escape, desperate maneuvers. Every calculation ended the same way, with the ripping sound of 650 caliber machine guns and a fireball. He took one last look at the sky above, at the hundreds of contrails that now webbed the heavens like the bars of a cage. The air was no longer his. It belonged to the Silver Hawks from across the ocean. The war in the skies had changed forever in the span of 20 minutes, and he was its first, stunned witness. With a final, agonized glance at his homeland on the horizon, Dieter Baumann slowly, deliberately, pushed the control stick forward, lowered his landing gear, and began a gentle descent towards the waiting sea below. The yellow-nosed Mustang slid in behind him, a silent, deadly escort to his captivity. But as his wheels touched the choppy, freezing water and the 109 began its rapid, sinking demise, Baumann's last sight, as he struggled out of the sinking cockpit into his life raft, was not of his conqueror. It was of the sky to the south. More contrails, hundreds more. A second wave was coming, and behind it he knew with a certainty that was worse than any bullet a third would follow, and a fourth. The little devils hadn't just arrived. They had come to stay. And as he shivered in the raft, watching the endless streams of silver aircraft pass overhead on their way to unleash hell on the Reich, Oberleutnant Dieter Baumann, holder of the Knight's Cross, ace of the Luftwaffe, understood the true, horrifying scale of the miscalculation. They hadn't been laughing at a clumsy, inferior enemy. They had been laughing at a hurricane they refused to see coming. And now, the storm had made landfall. The freezing water hit him like 1,000 needles, shocking the last vestiges of cockpit warmth from his body. Dieter Baumann fought against the parachute harness, the heavy leather jacket now a waterlogged anchor. The Bf-109, his rote dray, hissed and gurgled as it slipped beneath the gray waves. The tail with its 41 black crosses the last thing to disappear. The life raft, automatically inflated from his seat pack, bobbed violently in the chop. He hauled himself into the fragile rubber craft, his muscles screaming from the cold, his fingers already numb and clumsy. Above him, the yellow-nosed Mustang made one last, slow pass. The American pilot dipped his wings once more, then pointed his nose upward and climbed back towards the armada in the sky, his mission complete. Baumann was alone on the heaving sea, a prisoner of the water and the new reality. He fumbled with the raft's emergency kit, his hands shaking too badly to open the tin of dye marker. He simply sat, water pooling around his boots, and watched the sky. The contrails he had seen from above now formed a solid, moving ceiling. They were not random. They were organized highways, flowing eastward in relentless, parallel streams. He counted the bomber formations. Not just the B-17s he had initially engaged and the B-24s he had spotted, but a third wave of Lancasters, their silhouettes distinct even at altitude. And around each stream, like pilot fish around sharks, swarmed the glittering dots of the Mustangs. His trained eye estimated numbers, and the figures his mind produced were incomprehensible. Over 500 heavy bombers, perhaps 200, 300 fighters, all of them deep over occupied territory, all of them protected. A low droning became a roar as a formation of B-17s passed almost directly overhead, their shadows flickering across the waves. They were untouched. No black smoke trails of dying aircraft marred their procession. The defensive fire from their turrets was sporadic, untested. They had no need of it. The Luftwaffe had been swept from their path. Baumann's radio, salvaged from his jacket, emitted only static and the faint, panicked remnants of German transmissions. Jäger überall, wo sind unsere Jäger? Zurückkehren. Alles zurückkehren. The voices were young, terrified, and then they were gone, cut off mid-sentence. He was found not by a German seaplane, but by an American PBY Catalina, its gull wings unmistakable as it circled low over the water 2 hours later. The flying boat landed expertly on the swells, and 2 crewmen helped the shivering, defeated ace aboard. They treated him with a brusque, professional kindness, wrapping him in blankets and offering him a cigarette. They did not gloat. They seemed almost bored, as if plucking down Luftwaffe pilots from the North Sea was a routine chore. One of them, a sergeant with a Brooklyn accent, looked at Baumann's waterlogged insignia and said, "Knight's Cross, huh? You've had a rough morning, pal." The comment wasn't mocking. It was an observation of fact. The scale of their operation was so vast that the capture of a decorated ace was a minor administrative footnote. As the Catalina droned toward Scotland, Baumann sat by a small window, staring out. Below, the North Sea was dotted with other rafts and patches of yellow dye. Some held German airmen. Others held American or British crews from the rare bomber that had gone down. The rescue operation was itself a massive, coordinated effort, a further demonstration of Allied logistical depth he could scarcely comprehend. But it was the view to the east that held him. The contrail highway still stretched, a lattice of white against the blue, leading deep into the heart of the Reich. The storm was not abating. It was intensifying. While Baumann was being processed into captivity, the hurricane he had witnessed made landfall across the entire breadth of German defenses. April 8, 1944, was not an isolated incident. It was the opening day of Operation Point Blank's final, decisive phase. The Mustang's arrival was systemic, simultaneous, and catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Over Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing plants that had cost the Allies so dearly in the autumn of 1943 were hit again. But this time, the narrative was reversed. Major Hans-Heinrich Koenig, a Gruppenkommandeur of JG-27 flying a Focke-Wulf 190 Ammonus 8, led 30 fighters to intercept. They were met not by unescorted bombers, but by 3 full groups of P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group, already orbiting at 28,000 feet. The German attack never reached the bomber stream. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Koenig witnessed a tactical evolution that rendered his unit's hard-won experience obsolete. The Mustangs refused to engage in turning fights at low altitude. Instead, they used their superior high-altitude performance in a series of slashing, hit-and-run attacks. They would dive, fire a brief, devastating burst, and then climb away before we could bring our guns to bear, he wrote in a report later smuggled from his POW camp. It was like fighting ghosts. We lost 12 aircraft in as many minutes. I counted only 2 confirmed kills. The ratio was impossible. The statistics from that single day across all fronts were a body blow to the Jagdwaffe. Luftwaffe Quartermaster General returns, stamped Geheim Secret, and dated April 10, listed 94 fighter pilots killed or missing and 147 aircraft destroyed or written off. American losses for the day totaled 31 bombers and 11 fighters, a kill-to-loss ratio that had once been a comfortable 1.5. One in Germany's favor had inverted to a devastating 4.7, one against them. More chilling than the numbers was the nature of the losses. Of the 94 German pilots, 38 were experienced formation leaders or Staffelkapitän, men who could not be replaced in 6 weeks of accelerated training, but in 6 months, if at all. The institutional memory of the Luftwaffe was being erased from the sky at a rate its training schools could not possibly match. In the weeks that followed, the grim arithmetic became the new normal. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment dated May 1, 1944, marked für den Reichsmarschall nur, for the Reichsmarschall only, contained a graph that told the story in red and black ink. The line representing Allied bomber losses, which had spiked dramatically during the unescorted raids of 1943, had now flattened into a shallow, steady decline. The line representing German fighter losses, meanwhile, ascended in a near-vertical climb from March onward. A handwritten note in the margin, attributed to General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, read, "The enemy fighter now determines when and where combat takes place. We have lost the initiative in our own airspace." The reaction within the German High Command was a toxic mixture of denial, fury, and desperate improvisation. In the Führerbunker, Hitler raged at Goering, blaming the Luftwaffe's cowardice and demanding immediate technological miracles. The response was a series of frantic, poorly coordinated programs that highlighted the fundamental disparity between the two industrial systems. Engineers at Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt were ordered to push new variants into production. The FW-190D with a longer nose and Junkers Jumo engine, the BF-100 and 9000 with a more powerful DB-605. These were excellent aircraft, capable of meeting the Mustang on more equal terms at high altitude. But the orders came with impossible deadlines and amidst crippling shortages of strategic materials, skilled labor, and fuel for testing. Production of the BF-100 and 9000, for example, was slated to begin in August 1944. By June, American Mustang production at North American's Inglewood and Dallas plants alone was exceeding 550 units per month, more than the total German fighter production of all types for the same period. Other wonder weapon concepts, born of desperation, consumed resources that could have been used to build conventional fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a rocket-powered point defense interceptor, was a technical marvel. It could climb to bomber altitude in minutes and was faster than anything in the sky. But its volatile fuel made it a death trap for its pilots. Its flight duration was barely 10 minutes, and it could be produced only in tiny numbers. In the same time it took to build, test, and deploy one squadron of Comets, the United States produced an entire fighter wing of P-51s. The disparity was not of quality, but of scale and focus. Germany was trying to win the war with laboratory breakthroughs. America was winning it on assembly lines. The shockwaves of the Mustang's dominance rippled out to other combatants, who saw their own certainties unravel. On the other side of the world, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite 343rd Air Group studied captured Allied intelligence reports with growing alarm. Flying the formidable Kawanishi N-1 Katewoje Shidenkai, George, a fighter designed to counter the American Hellcat and Corsair, he recognized a familiar pattern. A translated American technical evaluation of a captured German FW-190, circulated by Japanese naval attachés in Berlin, praised the Mustang's role in neutralizing it. The report's language was clinical, but the implication was clear. American engineering had solved the problem of the high-performance enemy fighter not by copying it, but by creating a machine of superior range, speed, and production simplicity. Nakajima wrote in his diary, "The German experience is a warning. They believed their machines and their pilots were superior. They were defeated not by a better warrior, but by a better system. The Americans do not seek a samurai duel. They seek to drown the samurai in a flood of steel. Our spirit cannot fight their statistics forever." In a bombs-card hangar outside Bremen, a team of Reichsluftwaffe Ministerium technical officers performed a post-mortem on a rare prize, a P-51 billion Mustang that had made a forced landing with only minor damage. The report they filed was a masterpiece of reluctant admiration. Oberingenieur Klaus Ritter, a veteran of the BMW engine division, focused on the heart of the machine. The Packard-built Merlin V-1650-7 engine, he wrote, is a masterpiece of production engineering. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger is mechanically complex, yet it is assembled with such precision and standardization that it maintains peak power from sea level to over 30,000 feet. Our DB-605, by comparison, suffers from a single-stage supercharger that loses effectiveness dramatically above 8,000 meters. The metallurgy of the Merlin's components is consistently superior. They have access to nickel and chromium alloys we can no longer obtain. The engine is not more advanced in concept than our own. It is simply better built, in greater numbers with better materials. His colleague, studying the airframe, noted the laminar flow wing. The wing surface is so smooth that a machining imperfection of more than 0.1 millimeters was considered a reject. The riveting is flush and perfect. This attention to drag reduction is not for aesthetic purpose. It translates directly into greater speed and range for a given fuel load. We understood the theory. They applied it on an industrial scale. The report concluded with a grim summation. The Mustang is not an invincible aircraft. It can be outmaneuvered at low speed and has vulnerabilities. However, its combination of high-altitude performance, range, speed, and ruggedness, produced in such quantity, represents a systems-level advantage we cannot counter with current technology and production capabilities. Recommendations for the TA-152 high-altitude interceptor program must be accelerated, but even its projected performance will be negated by the Mustang's numerical superiority. The human cost of this systems-level failure was etched into the faces of the men who commanded the Jagdwaffe. General Galland, summoned to the Hall Göring's opulent estate, found himself not in a strategy session, but the target of a blistering tirade. Göring, waving the latest loss figures, accused his pilots of lacking nerve. Galland, who had flown over 300 combat missions, famously retorted, "Herr Reichsmarschall, give me a squadron of Mustangs and I will show you nerve." The remark nearly ended his career, but it captured the helpless fury of the professional soldier. The weapon he needed existed. It was just flying for the other side. In the ready rooms of fighter bases across France and Germany, the mood shifted from confidence to grim resignation. Veteran aces, men with over 100 victories, began to speak of the law of averages in hushed tones. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, the future highest-scoring ace in history, returning to his base at Budapest after a harrowing mission where his swarm was bounced by Mustangs, wrote to his fiancée, "The sky is no longer ours. We take off only when we must, and we look up constantly. The Amis are always above. The new pilots arrive younger and younger with 30 hours in a fighter. They are dead before they learn to properly trim their aircraft. It is not a war anymore. It is a slaughter." The collapse of the Luftwaffe's defensive capability had immediate and cascading strategic effects. With air superiority over Western Europe now firmly in Allied hands, the preparatory bombing campaign for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, could proceed with impunity. Transportation networks in France were systematically destroyed. Bridges, rail yards, and locomotives were obliterated. The Panzer divisions stationed in the Pas-de-Calais, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps included, found their movement to the future beachhead hampered not by French resistance sabotage alone, but by a total paralysis of the rail system imposed from the air. The Mustang's long loiter time meant that armed reconnaissance missions could hunt targets of opportunity across the entire breadth of northern France. A German military traffic report from May 15, 1944, lamented, "Daylight movement of any formation larger than company strength is immediately detected and attacked by enemy fighter bombers." The term Jabo, fighter bomber, now inspires more fear among ground troops than the heavy bombers. Perhaps the most profound psychological blow was the erosion of the myth of German technological supremacy. For years, the propaganda machine had touted the innate genius of German engineering. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were indeed terrifying wonders. But they were complex, expensive, and ultimately strategically irrelevant terror weapons. The P-51 Mustang was a wonder of a different order, a reliable, maintainable, mass-produced tool that achieved decisive tactical and strategic results. When ground crews and junior pilots saw the sleek, silver American fighters circling arrogantly over their own airfields, a practice the Americans called fighter sweeps, the message was unmistakable. The enemy was not only unafraid, he was so confident in his machine's superiority that he could loiter in what was once your sanctuary. For Dieter Baumann, the reality of the new war was absorbed in the sterile, orderly confines of a British POW camp. The interrogation at the London cage was not the brutal ordeal he had been warned about. His captors, officers from the RAF's air intelligence, were polite, professional, and astonishingly well informed. They knew his name, his rank, his squadron, and even the names of his former wingmen. They showed him reconnaissance photographs of his own airfield in Norway, taken the day after his capture. They were crystal clear, showing every revetment and fuel dump. "Your radar station at Lista was hit by typhoons this afternoon," one interrogator mentioned casually. The raid was escorted by the 339th Fighter Group. Mustangs, of course. The most humbling experience came not from interrogation, but from a simple train journey. In late May 1944, Baumann and a group of other captured Luftwaffe airmen were transferred to a camp in Canada. Their train passed near Detroit, Michigan. For 2 hours, the prisoners stared in silent disbelief at the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant. A single, continuous building stretched for over a mile. From one end rolled finished B-24 Liberator bombers, one every 63 minutes. The scale was beyond German comprehension. A Luftwaffe Oberfeldwebel next to Baumann, a veteran of the Eastern Front, whispered, "We have been fighting a nation that does this as its normal business. How could we ever have believed we would win?" Baumann had no answer. He thought of the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, a target he had helped defend, with its artisanal production lines and constant vulnerability to bombing. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was a statement of geopolitical fact. In the camp, news from the fronts filtered in via clandestine radios and new arrivals. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, was launched under a canopy of total Allied air supremacy. The Luftwaffe managed only a few hundred sorties over the beaches, compared to the Allies' 14,000. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts ruled the skies, strafing anything that moved. The long-range fighter had not only made the strategic bombing campaign possible, it had made the invasion feasible. The chain of causality was direct and undeniable. Baumann spent his captivity in a state of quiet, profound reckoning. The black crosses painted on his lost rote dray represented a world that no longer existed. He had been a master of a domain that had been rendered obsolete. He replayed the engagement of April 8th endlessly in his mind, not with a sense of tactical regret, but with a dawning understanding of the vast, impersonal forces that had orchestrated his defeat. The American pilot in the yellow-nosed Mustang had not been a superior warrior. He had been the willing, well-trained component of a system that provided him with a superior tool, superior intelligence, and the confidence that came from overwhelming numerical and industrial backing. The Fingerspitzengefühl, the instinctive feel, that German command had prized above all else was meaningless against such a system. Instinct could not outrun a .50 caliber bullet fired from a platform that could choose the time and place of every engagement. The final, devastating ledger of the Mustang's impact was written in the cold statistics of the war's conclusion. Between D-Day and VE Day, the USAAF's 8th and 9th Air Forces lost 21 13 P-51 Mustangs in combat over Europe. In that same period, Luftwaffe records indicate that Mustang pilots were credited with the destruction of 4950 German aircraft in air-to-air combat, a ratio of better than 2:1. But the true number was likely higher, as many German losses went unrecorded in the chaos of the final collapse. More importantly, the Mustang's presence made possible the destruction of thousands more aircraft on the ground, in trains, and in factories. By the war's end, the United States had built 15,875 P-51 Mustangs of all variants. Germany, in its entire war effort, produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all types, an aircraft that had entered the war nearly a decade earlier. The Mustang's production run, achieved in just 3 years of peak output, was half of the 109's total lifetime output. This single American model, conceived, perfected, and built in the blink of an eye historically, matched half the production of the Luftwaffe's most iconic fighter. When combined with the 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts and 10,037 P-38 Lightnings also produced, the numerical reality was apocalyptic for Germany. They were not fighting an air force. They were fighting the industrial output of a continent-sized economy now fully mobilized. The human toll on the Jagdwaffe was even more catastrophic. Of the approximately 28,000 fighter pilots who served in the Luftwaffe during the war, over 12,000 were killed, missing, or captured in the period from January 1944 to May 1945, the period of the Mustang's dominance. The average life expectancy of a new pilot at the front in early 1944 plummeted to just 17 combat sorties. The experienced cadre, the men who could teach the newcomers, were gone. What remained was a hollow force, flying increasingly sophisticated but ever rarer aircraft, against an enemy whose numbers and technological edge only grew. In the final days of the war, as Baumann sat in his Canadian camp reading about the fall of Berlin, he received a letter from his sister in Hamburg. She described the utter devastation of the city, the result of relentless firebombing raids that had faced negligible opposition. "The sky belongs to them," she wrote. "We see the silver fighters every day watching us. They are like birds of prey that have driven all other birds from the sky." Her words brought back the image of the yellow-nosed Mustang rocking its wings, the silent, confident gesture that had ended his war. The legacy of the technological and tactical shift Baumann witnessed on April 8, 1944, extended far beyond the war. It established a template for American military dominance for the rest of the century. The integration of advanced technology, mass production, rigorous training, and overwhelming logistical support. The Mustang was the harbinger of this new American way of war, where industrial capacity and scientific management were as decisive as courage and skill. Years later, in 1953, a retired Dieter Baumann, working as a civil engineer in a rebuilt West Germany, attended an air show where a restored P-51D performed. The sound of the Merlin engine stopped him cold, a visceral punch to the gut. He watched the sleek aircraft carve through the sky, its performance still breathtaking. An American veteran standing next to him, noticing his fixed gaze, said, "Beautiful, ain't she? Saved a lot of lives, that bird." Baumann nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied in careful English. "It ended many and saved many more. It was inevitable." He did not elaborate. He simply watched the silver shape climb into the sun, a ghost from a hurricane that had swept away his world and reshaped another. He had been a knight of the sky, and he had lived just long enough to see the age of knights pass, replaced by the age of engineers, factories, and the cold, beautiful logic of mass production. The little devils had not just won the war. They had ushered in a new era, and he, like his defeated nation, had been forced to learn to live in its shadow. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was forever changed.